The Vietnam War stands as one of the most controversial and divisive conflicts in American history, a war that not only altered U.S. foreign policy but also shook the foundations of American society. To understand the Vietnam War, it's important to explore its causes, U.S. involvement, the powerful protest movements it sparked, and the long-lasting effects it had on the American psyche. Origins of the Vietnam conflict. The roots of the Vietnam War can be traced back to the end of World War II, when Vietnam, a French colony, sought independence. In 1945, revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, hoping to free the country from foreign domination. However, the French sought to retain control, leading to the First Indochina War between French forces and the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh's communist-led independence movement. After the French defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the Geneva Accords were signed, temporarily dividing Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, became a communist state, while the South, under Ngo Dinh Diem, was backed by the West. U.S. involvement and the domino theory. The United States' involvement in Vietnam was driven by the Cold War context. The U.S. feared the spread of communism in Asia, subscribing to the domino theory, which suggested that if one country fell to communism, others in the region would follow. In 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower began supporting South Vietnam, providing economic and military aid to counter the communist threat from the north. By the early 1960s, as the Communist National Liberation Front, Viet Cong, gained ground in South Vietnam, U.S. involvement escalated. President John F. Kennedy sent military advisors to aid the South Vietnamese government. After Diem's assassination in 1963 and the increasing instability in South Vietnam, U.S. involvement deepened under President Lyndon B. Johnson. The Gulf of Tonkin and full-scale U.S. intervention. The turning point came in August 1964, with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked U.S. Navy vessels, though the details of the incident remain disputed. Johnson used the event to secure congressional approval for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, granting him broad powers to wage war in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. By 1965, the U.S. had begun full-scale military intervention, launching Operation Rolling Thunder, an extensive bombing campaign, and deploying combat troops to Vietnam. Over the next several years, U.S. forces grew to over 500,000 soldiers. Despite their overwhelming firepower, the U.S. military faced a well-organized and highly motivated enemy. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics, blending into the civilian population, making it difficult for U.S. forces to achieve a decisive victory. Challenges on the ground and the Tet Offensive. The Vietnam War became a quagmire for the United States. Soldiers faced harsh jungle conditions, booby traps, and an elusive enemy. As the war dragged on, the lack of a clear objective demoralized American troops and sparked widespread frustration. Meanwhile, back in the US, the government continued to claim that victory was near. This optimism was shattered by the Tet Offensive in January 1968, when the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched coordinated attacks on major South Vietnamese cities and US military bases. Though U.S. forces repelled the offensive, the scale and intensity of the attacks shocked the American public. It became clear that the war was far from over, contradicting the Johnson administration's claims of progress. The Tet Offensive marked a turning point in public opinion, fueling growing opposition to the war. The anti-war movement. As the Vietnam War escalated, so did opposition at home. The anti-war movement gained momentum in the 1960s, particularly among students, intellectuals, and civil rights activists. College campuses became hubs of protest, with organizations like the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, leading the charge. The draft, which forced young men into military service, became a central issue for protesters, many of whom viewed the war as unjust and immoral. One of the most notable protests was the March on the Pentagon in 1967, where thousands of demonstrators gathered to voice their opposition to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The movement reached its peak after the Kent State shootings in 1970, when National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed student protesters, killing 4. This tragic event further galvanized public opposition to the war, and it became a symbol of the growing divide between the government and its citizens. prominent figures also joined the anti-war movement. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. famously condemned the war, linking it to broader issues of social injustice. Musicians like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Creedence Clearwater Revival used their music to criticize the war, spreading the message through songs like Fortunate Son and Blowin' in the Wind. Nixon's Vietnamization and the end of U.S. involvement. By 1969, the war had become politically untenable for the U.S. President Richard Nixon, elected that year, faced the challenge of ending American involvement without appearing to surrender to communism. His solution was Vietnamization, a strategy to gradually withdraw U.S. troops and shift the burden of fighting to South Vietnamese forces. While U.S. troop levels began to decrease, Nixon simultaneously expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia and Laos in an effort to cut off Viet Cong supply lines, sparking further protests at home. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed that successive U.S. administrations had misled the public about the scope and progress of the war, further eroding trust in the government. After years of negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, leading to a ceasefire and the withdrawal of U.S. forces. However, fighting between North and South Vietnam continued until 1975, when Saigon fell to the Communists, marking the end of the war. The war's impact on American society. The Vietnam War left deep scars on American society. It was the first war to be extensively televised, bringing the brutal realities of combat into American living rooms. Images of burning villages, wounded soldiers, and body bags made the war inescapable for the public. This visibility, combined with the government's perceived dishonesty, led to a profound disillusionment with authority, giving rise to what became known as the credibility gap. The war also left a lasting legacy of social and political upheaval. The anti-war movement intersected with other major social movements of the 1960s and 1970s, including the civil rights movement, women's liberation, and the counterculture. Many Americans began to question not just the war, but also broader issues of inequality, racism, and U.S. foreign policy. Veterans returning from Vietnam faced a difficult homecoming. Unlike previous wars, Vietnam veterans were not welcomed as heroes. Many returned with physical injuries or psychological trauma, including what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The lack of support and the hostile reception many veterans faced further deepened the societal wounds caused by the war. Political and cultural consequences. Politically, the Vietnam War had a profound impact on U.S. foreign policy. The failure to achieve victory in Vietnam led to a period of introspection, giving rise to what is known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance to engage in military interventions abroad for fear of becoming mired in another protracted conflict. This cautious approach would influence U.S. foreign policy for decades, from interventions in the Middle East to responses to global crises. Culturally, the Vietnam War influenced art, literature, and film. Movies like Apocalypse Now and Platoon depicted the war's horrors, while books such as The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien offered poignant reflections on the experiences of soldiers. These works became part of the broader national reckoning with the war, as Americans sought to understand and process the trauma it inflicted on the country. The Vietnam War was a defining moment in U.S. history. It was a conflict that not only altered the course of the Cold War but also reshaped American society, politics, and culture. The war's legacy, of distrust in government, protest movements, and the struggles of veterans, continues to influence the United States to this day. The Vietnam War remains a powerful reminder of the complexities and consequences of war, both on the battlefield and at home. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos.